Hello, this is Christy, and I have a rather controversial topic today. And I am going to be reading some more than I usually do, but hopefully you will get the point. So throughout the history of the world, there have been leaders who have imposed their will over those that they conquered. So many went on to rule cruel regimes just by keeping the people powerless to resist. So the different Caesars, empires, pharaohs, they all conquered and ruled over people who were powerless to resist because they didn't have the means to do so. In more recent times, the invention of and mass production of firearms made conquering and then controlling entire populations a little more difficult. So that's why in the last 150 years that governments started trying to ban and confiscate our weapons. In our own country, before the Revolutionary War, some colonists did own firearms, but in the months before and just after the war, King George's generals implemented gun confiscation policies. So this is something that was a big factor in our Second Amendment, in the reasoning behind doing that. So since gun control is currently an issue, and some people in government and the uneducated call for outright gun bans and confiscation, it's important to look at the history of gun control around the world. So firearms were allowed to remain in the hands of the Soviet citizens until 1929, when private gun ownership was abolished. And this was when the rise of one of the most repressive regimes of Joseph Stalin began. So from 1929 to the year Stalin died, tens of millions were rounded up and were either murdered or placed in labor camps and prisons, which later caused their deaths as well. In 32 to 33, he engineered a famine. I didn't realize this. I hadn't heard this before. He engineered a famine by raising the grain quota that they were required to turn over to the state, and that killed 6 to 7 million people. Later, he even purged the Communist Party of anybody he believed was a threat, and all under the auspices of a total gun ban. Stalin once said, "If the opposition disarms, well and good. If it refuses to disarm, we shall disarm it ourselves." The Ottoman Empire implemented full gun control in 1911, and a few years later, starting in 1915 to 1917, some 1.5 million Armenians were rounded up and murdered, and the population was only like 2.5, so it is over half of their population. They also established butcher battalions that were violent criminals that were released from prison just to kill the ethnic Armenians. And those were the members of the army. They were disarmed, they were placed into labor battalions, and then they were killed. Germany established gun control in 1938, just before Hitler's campaign to exterminate the Jews. And in the end, 13 million Jews and other perceived lesser races were killed by Hitler and his Nazi party. In 1942, at the height of the Second World War and German advances, this is what Hitler said, and I'm going to read this quote. "The most foolish mistake we could possibly make would be to allow the subject races to possess arms. History shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subject races to carry arms have prepared their own downfall by so doing. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that the supply of arms to the underdogs is a sine qua non for the overthrow of any sovereignty. So let's not have any native militia or native police. German troops alone will bear the sole responsibility for the maintenance of law and order throughout the occupied Russian territories, and a system of military strongpoints must be evolved to cover the entire occupied country." The Chinese government established gun control in 1935, which was just 2 years before Japan invaded. From 35 to 52, around 20 million were murdered. The Chinese Cultural Revolution, which was launched by Mao Zedong, took place in 66 to 76 and claimed the lives of several million people and inflicted cruel and inhuman treatments on hundreds of millions of people. The year Cambodia issued its total gun control edict was in 56, and for them it took a little bit longer. Between 75 and 77, the regime murdered as many as 1 million educated people, whom he believed represented a threat to his power in the killing fields, and that was turned into a movie also. In all, more than 56 million people around the world have been murdered as a result of gun control laws imposed by rulers who knew that the only way that they could continue to stay in power was by disarming them. And now politicians and the uneducated want our leaders to have the same ability to rule unopposed and unafraid of reprisal. Now, anytime we let the government have more control, it leads to more control. So although some would argue that gun control has nothing to do with zoning laws, it is all about the government having more control and us letting them get away with it. So if we can get the zoning ordinance to a vote, whether it passes or not, we are one step closer to less government control instead of giving up more of our freedoms. So if you are registered in the city of Littlefield, Texas, send me a message. If you like your freedom, if you want to keep your guns, please send me a message so we can gain a little bit of our freedom back. If you believe in what our military has fought for, if you want to continue to live in the best country on earth, send me a message.